Nobody warned me it would start with a glove. That's the thing nobody tells you about obsession. It doesn't arrive like a storm. It doesn't knock. It slips in sideways through something so small, so embarrassingly ordinary, that you almost miss it, and then you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the version of yourself that didn't notice. I was 34 years old, standing on a wet pavement outside Windsor Castle on a Tuesday morning in November, holding a coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago when it happened. I wasn't supposed to be there, honestly. Not in any existential sense. I mean, literally, I had a meeting at 2. I was a researcher. Freelance. The kind of job that sounds more exciting than it is, where you spend most of your life with your face inside a laptop, pulling threads on things other people find boring. History, protocol, institutional memory, the stuff that makes normal people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties. I come to Windsor for something unrelated, a small piece I was writing about architectural restoration on the East Wing, the kind of article that gets published in a quarterly journal that maybe 300 people read. My contact had canceled that morning. Rain, he said. Delayed train. British excuses for a British day. So I had 3 hours to kill and nowhere to be, and somehow I ended up standing near the lower ward watching the changing of the guard because there was nothing else to do, and the coffee shop had run out of seats. The crowd wasn't enormous. November keeps the casual tourists away. The ones who show up in November are either serious historians, military buffs, people with clipboards, and camera lenses the size of dinner plates. Or they're the ones who stumbled in by accident, like me, slightly damp and vaguely purposeless. A German family to my left, 2 kids who had already started arguing about something. A woman in a yellow coat who kept lifting her phone and then lowering it again like she couldn't decide whether the moment was worth capturing. A retired-looking man in a flat cap who hadn't moved in 10 minutes. He had the stillness of someone who'd been watching this exact ceremony for 20 years and had strong opinions about it. I don't have strong opinions about ceremonial ritual, or I didn't then. The ceremony began the way it always begins. Precisely. The kind of precision that doesn't feel human until you stand close enough to see a man breathing inside it. The guards move the way water moves when it has somewhere to go. Not fast, not slow, but with an absolute certainty of direction that is almost violent in its confidence. Boots on stone. That sound. If you haven't heard it close up, you haven't heard it. It's not like anything else. It lands somewhere between music and threat. I was watching loosely, processing without really engaging. My mind was still half on the article, half on the cancel meeting, half on whether I'd left my laptop charger at the bed, and breakfast. That's 3 halves, I know. Researcher brain. It's always running 2 tabs, too many. And then, one of the guards, the one on the far left of the formation, maybe 20 feet from where I was standing, did something with his left hand. Or rather, his left hand did something without him. It was a flex, a small, involuntary clench of the fingers inside the white glove. Not a scratch, not a reach, just a clench held for maybe 2 seconds, and then released. The glove creased along the knuckles. A small topography of strain appeared, and then smoothed itself back out. That was it. That was the whole thing. And yet, I looked around me. The German family. The yellow coat woman. The flat cap man. Nobody. Not a flicker. The collective gaze of that small crowd moved with the formation like iron filings following a magnet. And not one person had caught what I'd caught. Maybe there was nothing to catch. I told myself that. Muscle twitch. Cold. Long-standing. Any of 100 physical explanations that had nothing to do with anything. But I kept watching. I'm going to tell you something about how my brain works, because it matters for what comes next. When I was 12, my mother took me to watch a local theater production of Shakespeare play. I want to say it was Twelfth Night, but honestly it might have been Much Ado. The memory is faded around the edges. What I remember clearly is this. Halfway through the second act, one of the actors, a secondary character, a servant or messenger, someone without important lines, walked across the back of the stage in a way that was slightly wrong. Nothing big. A half beat off the blocking. A glance in the wrong direction. Nobody in that audience noticed. I noticed. I couldn't stop noticing. I sat through the rest of the play with that single wrong step living in my chest like a splinter. Not because I was a theater kid or a blocking expert. Because my brain, for reasons I've never been able to fully explain to anyone, including 2 separate therapists, catalogs disruptions. Small breaks in pattern. The scene where the expected and the actual pull apart by 1 millimeter. It has made me a decent researcher. It has made me a difficult person to share a meal with. My ex-wife used to say I watched the world like I was waiting for it to make a mistake. She said it with love at first. Later she said it with something else. I don't blame her. There are things you can't unknow about a person, and the thing she couldn't unknow about me was that even on our wedding day, even at the exact moment she was walking toward me down the aisle, some part of my brain was cataloging the way the flower arrangement on the second pew was slightly uneven. I noticed the glove, and my brain filed it. I went back 3 days later. That's not something I planned. I had a deadline. I had the architectural piece half finished, and a follow-up email from the journal sitting unanswered in my inbox. But Wednesday morning came, and I took the train back to Windsor, and I stood in approximately the same position, and I watched the changing of the guard again. Different guards. Same ceremony. Same precision. Same boots on stone. No love. I felt something that was embarrassingly close to disappointment. I almost laughed at myself, standing there in the damp. 34 years old, a man with a graduate degree and a half-finished article and genuine responsibilities, and I was disappointed that a ceremonial soldier hadn't made a small involuntary hand movement. Get it together, I thought. I went home, but here's the thing about pattern recognition. It doesn't clock out when you tell it to. I started reading. Not obsessively. I told myself it wasn't obsessive, which is probably the most defining characteristic of someone who is being obsessive. I started reading about ceremonial protocols, military ritual, the history of the household division, the specific regiment rotations, the choreography of the changing of the guard, the inches-precise choreography that has been drilled into these men until it lives in their bodies the way language lives in their mouths. Do you know how precise it is? Most people don't. Most people see the red coats and the bearskin caps, and they think tradition in a vague, postcard way. They don't think about the fact that the pace is regulated to 116 steps per minute, that the sword must be held at a specific angle depending on the precise moment in the sequence, that there is a moment, a very specific, very choreographed moment, in which the new guard and the old guard face each other, and the regimental sergeant major inspects equipment, and this inspection has been conducted in essentially the same form since the 17th century. I read about that inspection moment specifically. I read about what it's supposed to look like, the posture, the positioning, the exact order of events. And then I went back to Windsor on a Friday, and this time I brought my actual camera, the proper one, not just my phone, and I stood where I'd stood before, and I watched. I watched the inspection moment, and I saw it. Not the glove this time. Something else. The RSM, the regimental sergeant major conducting the inspection, paused for maybe 1 full second longer than the protocol dictated, in front of the third guard in the line, just a fraction of a held breath, a suspension that was so small, so paper-thin, that you would have to know exactly what you were looking for to see it. I knew what I was looking for. The pause happened. It lasted 1 second, maybe 1.5. The RSM moved on. The crowd took photos. The boots struck the stone. I stood there with my camera at my side, having completely forgotten to take a single photograph. And I thought, something is wrong. I want to be careful here. I want to be precise because precision matters, and because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of thing that can very easily tip into the territory of conspiracy theory and mania and all the other words that get used to dismiss a person when what they've actually done is pay closer attention than anyone else in the room. I am not, was not then, am not now, a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in hidden cabals or coded signals or the idea that reality is secretly organized against ordinary people. I'm a researcher. I believe in evidence. I believe in sources. I believe in the boring, grinding, unglamorous work of corroboration. What I believed, standing outside Windsor on a November Friday with a camera I'd forgotten to use, was this. Something was happening inside these ceremonies that was not visible in any public documentation. A disruption, possibly small, possibly meaningless, but real. Real, and unacknowledged. That second part was what kept me up that night. The unacknowledging. Not just that no one in the crowd noticed. Crowds don't notice most things. That's not a criticism. That's just what crowds are. But I've been reading the ceremonial protocols with enough attention to know that the RSM noticed things. That was his job. That was the entire architecture of his role in the ceremony. He was the noticing, and yet he'd moved on, which meant either he hadn't seen it, or he had, and the ceremony continued anyway. Both of those options kept me staring at the ceiling of the bed and breakfast at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, listening to the rain on the window, thinking about a 1-second pause and a gloved hand and a seam in something that was supposed to be seamless. I called my friend Marcus on Saturday morning. Marcus is the only person I know who can tolerate my tangents, partly because he's a former military man himself, served in the Royal Logistics Corps for 8 years before transitioning into logistics consultancy, and partly because his own brain runs on a similar frequency to mine. He notices the floor plan of a room when he walks into it. He counts exits. We have very calm dinner parties together. I need to ask you something about ceremonial guards, I said, when he picked up. A pause. Before coffee or after? I've had two. Then go. I told him what I'd seen. The glove. The pause. I described them carefully, without editorializing, the way you describe an anomaly in a dataset to someone who'd know what to do with it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You know those men trained for years, he said finally. I know. Any twitch or pause you're seeing from the outside. There are 1,000 explanations. I know, I said again. But there's no acknowledgement. That's what I keep coming back to. The protocol exists to handle disruptions. Their response is built into the choreography for when something goes wrong. And none of those responses were triggered, which means either nothing went wrong, which is possible, or something went wrong, and the response was suppressed. Another pause. Longer. Or, Marcus said carefully, you're building a pattern from 2 unrelated data points. I didn't answer immediately, because he wasn't wrong. That was a real possibility. That was the most likely possibility, statistically. I know, I said for the 3rd time. But you're going back, he said. It wasn't a question. Next Tuesday, I said. He exhaled, not with exasperation. Marcus doesn't do exasperation. It's one of his better qualities. More like a man who has seen this road before and knows where it goes and has decided to let his friend walk it anyway. Take better notes, he said. Don't just watch. Write down timestamps. Exact positions. If you're building a case, build it properly. I'm not building a case. You absolutely are, he said. Coffee first, though. Always coffee first. I went back Tuesday, and Wednesday, and the Friday after that. By the end of November, I had 14 pages of handwritten notes. Timestamps. Positions. I'd started sketching diagrams, rough outlines of the formation, the positions of individual guards, arrows indicating deviation from the documented choreography. I'd printed out 3 different sources on household division protocols and marked them up until they were more highlighter than page. I found 4 more anomalies. Small, precise, unacknowledged, a sword angle, held 2 degrees off the documented position for the duration of 1 full circuit of the courtyard before correcting. A moment in the musical accompaniment, the band, the drummer specifically, where the rhythm stuttered by what felt like half a beat before recovering so smoothly that I nearly second-guessed myself. A guard who, during the moments of stillness, blinked at a rate significantly higher than the men on either side of him. Not a big thing. Not something you'd write home about. But I'd read enough by then to know that controlling blink rate was part of the training. The stillness was not natural. It was performed, and performing it required a specific kind of internal regulation that, when disrupted, produced exactly this, a small cascade of involuntary blinks that the crowd read as nothing and I read as a system under strain. And on the 4th Friday, the last Friday of November, a morning so cold the tourists had thinned to almost nothing, I saw something that was not small at all. I saw the RSM break formation. 2 steps. 2 steps to the left, away from his documented position, before returning to it. The whole deviation lasted maybe 4 seconds. The ceremony continued. I looked around at the handful of people still watching. The flat-cap man was there again. He'd been there several times. I'd started to recognize him the way you recognize a regular at a coffee shop. Not quite a familiar, but a presence that accumulates meaning through repetition. He was looking at me, not at the guards, at me. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, back at the ceremony, like the moment hadn't happened. But it had. And my brain, which catalogs disruptions, filed it. I didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. I sat with my notes spread across the bed and breakfast desk, and I thought about what I was actually doing. A researcher, I told myself, follows evidence. Doesn't overinvest. Doesn't build cathedrals from cornerstones. The protocol is clear: observe, document, corroborate, and only then conclude. I had observation. I had documentation. I did not have corroboration. I needed someone else to have seen what I'd seen. Not just Marcus, who'd taken my word for it on the phone. Someone who'd been there. Someone with eyes on the same ceremony at the same moment. I thought about the flat-cap man. I thought about the way he'd looked at me. 2 steps to the left. For seconds. The ceremony continued. I picked up my pen and opened a fresh page of the notebook, and I wrote at the top, in capital letters, the question that had been living in my chest since the morning of the glove. Who else has noticed? And underneath it, smaller, almost a whisper in pen, and why aren't they saying anything? His name was Gerald Fitch. I found that out on a Thursday afternoon in early December, 3 weeks into what I had stopped calling research, and started calling, in the privacy of my own skull, never aloud, the investigation. Investigator feels like a word with a handle on it. A word that implies training and authority and someone waiting for a report. I had none of those things. I had a notebook and a persistent feeling behind my sternum that something was not right. Gerald Fitch, retired, 71 years old, though he wore it like 63, straight back, deliberate walk, the kind of posture that doesn't come from yoga, but from decades of someone telling you that your spine has military applications. He'd been coming to Windsor on ceremonial days for, I would learn this later, 11 years. Not as a tourist, not as a historian, exactly. As a watcher. I didn't know any of this when I approached him that Thursday. I knew only the flat cap, the stillness, and the look he'd given me on the last Friday of November. It was cold, the kind of cold that Windsor does particularly well. Not brutal, not dramatic, but persistent, the kind that gets into the joints and reminds you that England has strong opinions about the seasons. There are almost no tourists. A handful of dedicated photographers near the changing of the guard route, and Gerald, standing in his usual position, hands clasped behind his back, watching. I walked over and stood beside him. Not immediately. I gave it a few minutes, stood near enough, but not at him, the way you approach a bird you don't want to startle. Then I said, without preamble, because I've never been good at preamble, "You've been here before." Several times. He didn't turn to look at me. "So have you," he said. His voice was measured. Not unfriendly, but careful, like a man who weighs words before spending them. "I'm a researcher," I said. "I'm looking at ceremonial protocols." A pause. A long one. "Academically?" he asked. "Initially." He turned then, looked at me fully, with eyes that were very clear and very blue, and doing quite a lot of work. He was measuring something. I didn't know what. "What did you see?" he asked. "Not what are you researching? Not what brings you here? Not any of the normal transition questions that open a conversation between strangers. Just what did you see?" And I understood then that he already knew something. We went to a cafe around the corner. His suggestion. He knew it well. The woman behind the counter nodded at him without needing to ask his order, and he nodded back, and a tea arrived without ceremony, which somehow felt appropriate for a man who spent his Thursdays watching ceremony be performed. I had coffee, the real kind, from a machine that made sounds like it was settling a debt. He wrapped his hands around the tea mug. Large hands, knuckled and weathered in a way that suggests outdoor work, but the nails were clean and the skin around the thumbs was calloused in a specific pattern I recognized for photographs. The hand of a man who'd spent years holding a rifle in a formal grip. "You were in service," I said. He looked at me over the mug. "Coldstream Guards," he said. 22 years. A pause. "I was a sergeant." I opened my notebook. He watched me open it. He didn't tell me to put away. I told him what I'd seen, systematically, in order, the way Marcus had told me to document it. The glove, the inspection pause, the sword angle, the drummer, the blink rate, the RSM's two-step deviation. I talked for about 8 minutes. Gerald drank his tea. He did not interrupt. He did not make the expression people make when they think you've gone slightly wrong in the head. That particular arrangement of the eyebrows that means I'm listening politely, but I've categorized you as a problem. He made no expression at all. When I finished, he set his mug down. The RSM, he said. When he stepped left, was it before or after the guard on the east and completed his turn? I looked at my notes. After, I said. Maybe 2 seconds after. Gerald nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he already suspected. I've been watching that East End position for 6 weeks, he said. Here is what Gerald Fitch told me over 1 hour and 17 minutes in a Windsor cafe while the December rain started and stopped and started again outside. He had watched the ceremonial guard for 11 years. Not obsessively. The word he used was faithfully, and he said it with the specificity of someone who understood the difference. He had been part of these ceremonies for over 2 decades as a soldier. When he retired, the ceremonies did not retire. They continued without him, as they had continued long before him, as they would continue long after. He came to watch the way a craftsman might visit a workshop where he'd once built things, to see the work, to see the standard. And 6 weeks ago, almost exactly when I had first noticed the glove, Gerald had noticed something in the positioning of the East End Guard. Not a single anomaly. A pattern. Over 7 consecutive ceremonial appearances, the East End Guard had maintained a posture deviation, a fractional forward lean in the shoulders, that was consistent enough to be intentional and inconsistent enough with protocol to be unauthorized. You would not see it unless you knew the protocol with a soldier's precision. Gerald knew it with a soldier's precision. It's not a physical problem, he said. Not injury or strain. If it were, the deviation would be inconsistent. Variable. This is consistent, which means it's deliberate. Deliberate why? I said. Gerald looked at his tea. That is the question, he said quietly. And no one else has seen it? No one who would speak. He looked at me. The people around me at these events, the photographers, the tourists, even the military historians who show up occasionally, they're watching the spectacle. They're watching the whole, the ceremony as a totality. You have to watch the seams to see where the fabric is pulling. I thought about my mother's theater, the actor crossing the stage wrong, 30 years ago, and here I was still watching the seams. Have you spoken to anyone officially? I said. Gerald's expression shifted. The most minimal shift. The kind where nothing visibly changes, but the air around the face does. I made an inquiry, he said, through appropriate channels. Retired service. Former regiment. I sent a written note to the garrison administrative contact. A pause. I receive an acknowledgement. Standard. 3 lines. Thanking me for my interest. He said interest the way you'd say fever. Clinical. Distancing. Nothing followed, he said. No questions. No follow-up. No indication that the note had been read by anyone who knew what it contained. Or, I said carefully, indication that it had been read by someone who very much knew what it contained. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. Yes, he said, or that. I want to pause here and tell you what I was feeling, because feeling matters in this, and I don't want to pretend it didn't. I was afraid. A low-frequency, background fear. Not the sharp kind that makes you run, but the slow kind that makes you careful. The kind that lives under thoughts rather than on top of them. Because what Gerald was describing, and what my own observations were corroborating, was not a conspiracy. Not in the dramatic sense, not yet, maybe never. But it was a silence. A deliberate, organized silence around something that was visibly not right. And organized silence is its own kind of statement. I'm a researcher. I've spent years in archives and records offices and the dusty back corners of institutional memory. I know what it looks like when information is simply missing, lost, degraded, never recorded. And I know what it looks like when information has been removed. When the absence has edges. When the gap is too clean to be accidental. The response to Gerald's inquiry had edges. 3 lines. Standard. No follow-up. That's not negligence. That's a shape. We met 4 more times in December. Gerald and I. The cafe, always. His tea, my coffee, the rain doing its November into December thing outside. He brought notes on the third meeting, a small leather notebook, very old, the kind with the snap closure, filled with a handwriting so precise it looked typeset. 22 years of military discipline had produced a note-taker who made me look like a kindergartner with a crayon. He walked me through the history of the Coldstream Guard's ceremonial protocols with the patience of a man who understood that you couldn't see what he saw without first understanding what was supposed to be there. The foundation, the original design. We went back to the 17th century, the formation of the regiment under Charles II, the evolution of the ceremony across 3 centuries of monarchy, the specific moments that had been codified, drilled, preserved. He knew where every guard should be at every beat of the music. He knew the angle of every sword at every moment of the inspection. He knew it the way a pianist knows a concerto, not by reading it, but by having played it so many times it had moved into the body. And with that knowledge as the foundation, the anomalies I'd been logging for weeks began to assemble themselves differently, not as isolated twitches in an otherwise perfect machine, as a pattern. Systematic, occurring at specific moments in the ceremony, around specific positions in the formation. The East End position, I said on our 4th meeting. It's always the East End position. The RSM deviation, the inspection pause, they all center on that one slot in the formation. Gerald nodded. Yes, that's not random. No, it's also not in any rotation documentation I've found. The guard in that position, is it always the same man? Gerald was quiet for a moment. It's difficult to confirm individual identities, he said carefully. The bearskins and the dress uniform are designed partly to make individual soldiers indistinguishable. That is intentional. But he folded his hands around his tea mug. I serve with a man, he said. Good soldier. Very good, actually. He had a habit, entirely unconscious, of rolling the weight onto the outer edge of his left boot when standing at attention. 22 years, I watched men stand at attention. You learn their signatures, the way their bodies make small declarations inside the stillness. He paused. The East End guard rolls his weight to the outer edge of his left boot. I stared at him. You know who it is? I said. Gerald looked out the rain-streaked window. His jaw moved in a way that had nothing to do with speech. I serve with his father, he said finally. That sentence landed in the silence of the cafe, and neither of us said anything for a while. His name, the guard's name, the East End guard, Gerald told me eventually. I won't put it here, not the real one. I'll call it by what Gerald called him in that quiet voice in that cafe. The boy, even though he was in his late 20s. Gerald's generation used certain words a certain way. The boy's father had been Coldstream Guards. Career, military. Gerald hadn't served alongside him for long. Different postings, different eras. But the military world is small in the way villages are small, where everyone knows the people that everyone else knows. The boy had followed his father into the regiment. 2nd generation. The kind of lineage that carries weight in an institution that values lineage. And 8 months ago, according to what Gerald had quietly pieced together through channels I didn't ask him to specify, the boy's father had died. Not in service. Not dramatically. A long illness, the kind that takes its time. The boy had been given compassionate leave. Standard, appropriate, no story there. He had returned to duty after the requisite period, and the anomalies had begun within 3 weeks of his return. The forward lean, Gerald said. The inconsistency in stillness. The blink rate you logged. These are not a soldier malfunctioning. These are a soldier carrying something his training doesn't have a protocol for. I thought about what Gerald had told me, about what the stillness cost, about how performing that level of regulation required a specific internal state, and how grief absolutely demolishes your internal state in ways that don't resolve on a schedule. He's grieving, I said. He's performing while grieving, Gerald said, which is different. The ceremony is making a demand his body can no longer meet completely. And the RS knows. Gerald said it flat. No fake, no qualifier. The RSM knows. The The deviation you saw, the 2 steps, that was not a lapse. That was a check, stepping toward the East End position to assess, exactly as protocol dictates when a concern exists. But the ceremony continued. The ceremony always continues, Gerald said. He said it without drama, without judgment, with the simple weight of a man who had stood inside that requirement for 22 years. The ceremony always continues. I sat with that for a long time afterward. Drove back to London in the rain, which was thicker by then, the kind of rain that makes the motorway look like something remembered rather than something real. The wipers going, the radio off, my mind doing the thing it does, the cataloging, the pattern running, but slower now, more careful. Because what I'd found, what Gerald had found, and what we'd found together was not what I'd expected to find. I'd expected, I think, something institutional, something with edges and angles and the cold geometry of systems failing. A hidden protocol, a covered mistake. What I'd found instead was a man, a young man, standing inside an ancient ceremony with his father 4 months dead, performing a stillness his body no longer had access to, and an old sergeant coming back every Thursday to watch, not to report, not to expose, to witness, and the RSM stepping 2 paces left just once to check, and then the ceremony continuing, because the ceremony always continues. I pulled off the motorway at a service station somewhere past Slough and sat in the car with the engine running and the rain on the roof. My notes on the passenger seat. 14 pages of timestamps and positions and deviation angles and all the careful, precise architecture of a researcher doing his job. I thought about the German family who'd been there the first day, the yellow coat woman, the flat cap man I now knew as Gerald, the crowd that watches the totality. And I thought about the thing I'd been so certain was a failure, the unacknowledging, the silence, the organized absence of response. What if the silence was the response? What if the ceremony continuing was not the institution ignoring a fracture, but the institution choosing to hold the fracture inside itself without breaking? What if the RSM's 2 steps, that small, deliberate check, was not a failure protocol, but the enactment of a different, older one? The one that says, we see you. We do not expose you. We hold the line around you until you can hold it yourself. I didn't know if that was true. I still don't fully. But I sat in that service station car parked past Slough with the rain on the roof and the notes on the passenger seat, and I thought, maybe what I've been watching isn't a crack. Maybe it's a seam, and seams are where things are joined. I had one more thing to check. It was something Gerald had said in passing in our 3rd meeting that I'd written down and then not returned to because the conversation had moved on. He'd mentioned a specific moment in the ceremonial sequence, a particular beat in the music near the end of the changing, where protocol dictated a 4-second pause in the march, a held breath in the choreography, right before the final movement. He'd said that pause has changed length, not dramatically, not by a measure anyone but him would catch. But he was certain. I went back to Windsor on the last Thursday, before Christmas. I stood in the cold. There were almost no tourists. The ceremony moved with its ancient precision, the boots on the stone, the swords at their angles, the music filling the courtyard air. I had my notebook. I had a stopwatch on my phone, which I'd never used before, and which felt absurdly clinical in my hand, standing there in the December cold. The ceremony reached the beat Gerald had described. The 4-second pause. I started the timer. It held for 6 seconds. 2 extra seconds. So small. So nearly nothing. But I knew what I was looking for. I knew the foundation. And 6 seconds where forward documented was not nothing. 6 seconds. Maybe the duration of a breath held and released. Maybe the duration of a thought held and released. A small accommodation written into the choreography by someone who had the authority to change it and had done so without announcement or explanation. 2 extra seconds. The ceremony continued. I stood there with the stopwatch still open on my phone screen and the number 6 still visible and the boots striking the stone and the music resolving into its final movement. And I understood then that whoever held the 6 seconds was holding them for the boy. I called Gerald that evening. He picked up on the second ring. 6 seconds, I said. A pause. Yes, he said. I counted 7 the week before. Someone changed the protocol, I said. Someone with the authority, yes. That means it goes up, I said. The accommodation. It's not just the RSM making a field decision. Someone above the RSM authorized the change. Yes, Gerald said again, quietly. And no one is saying anything about it. No, he said. No one is saying anything. I stood at my window in London, looking out at the city. December dark, orange streetlight, people moving below with shopping bags and phone screens and the general forward momentum of a city that doesn't stop. Why are you coming back? I asked Gerald. Every week. What are you looking for now? The line was quiet for a moment. I'm not looking for anything, he said. I know what's there. Then, why? Because someone should see it, he said. Even if no one can say it. Even if it never gets recorded anywhere. Someone should stand there and see it properly. He paused. The boy is carrying something, he said, and the institution is carrying it with him in the only way it knows how. In silence. In accommodation. In a 6-second pause that nobody announces. Another pause. I was a sergeant for 15 years, he said. You know what a sergeant does, mostly? He makes sure his men are seen. Really seen. Not praised. Not evaluated. Seen. He stopped. I'm still a sergeant, he said. That part doesn't retire. January in Windsor is a different country from November. The tourists who'd been absent in the cold came back after Christmas, refreshed, newly motivated, with new cameras and children on school holidays and an inherited desire to stand in front of something old and feel connected to something. The ceremonial calendar resumed. The boots struck the stone. The music filled the courtyard, and the crowd watched, and the photographs were taken, and all of it continued, in the way that it always continues, that ancient forward momentum that doesn't ask permission from the calendar or the weather or the private interior states of the men performing it. I was there for the first ceremony of the new year. Gerald was there too. Same position, same flat cap, same stillness, which I now understood differently than I had in November. Not the stillness of a man watching a spectacle, but the stillness of a man paying a specific kind of attention. The kind that cost something. We stood near each other, but not together the way we'd fallen into doing. Separate enough to be strangers, close enough to exchange a look after. It was a quiet arrangement that suited both of us. The East End guard was in position. I watched his shoulders. The forward lean Gerald had identified. The fractional, consistent, unauthorized deviation that had started this whole chain of events for both of us was still there. Subtler, I thought. Or maybe I was imagining subtler because I wanted there to be a resolution. My brain is very good at finding patterns and not always trustworthy about finding endings. The ceremony moved through its sequence. I had long since stopped using the stopwatch, that it felt too clinical, too much like I was building a case rather than bearing witness, which was the word Gerald had given me for what we were doing and the only word that had ever felt accurate. I watched with my eyes, and my notes stayed in my pocket, and I stood in the January cold with the tourists and their cameras around me, one more person in a crowd, and I watched. The musical pause came. The 4-second moment that Gerald had told me held 6, sometimes 7. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The music resumed. Same as before. 2 extra seconds. Gerald's eyes found mine briefly across the crowd. Not a nod, not a signal, just a shared recognition, the briefest flicker of it. And then he looked back at the ceremony. We see it. That was all. Just that. I have thought many times in the months since about whether I should have done something differently. Whether the researcher's obligation, the corroborate, verify, publish imperative that is the whole architecture of the work I do, required me to take what I'd found and do something legible with it. Write it up. Submit it somewhere. File a formal inquiry the way Gerald had, but with more documentation, more specificity, more of the careful language that makes authorities feel like they're receiving information rather than being accused of something. I thought about it. I thought about it seriously. And then I thought about what publication would actually mean. In practice, what would do to the East End guard, the boy in Gerald's vocabulary, to have a freelance researcher's article circulating with timestamps and deviation logs, and the phrase unauthorized shoulder lean applied to a young man 4 months out of bereavement leave. The institution had chosen silence. The RSM had chosen 2 steps and a look and then continuity. Someone above the RSM had chosen 6 seconds. What had they chosen those things for? For the boy, to hold the space around him until he could hold it himself. And what would publication do to that space? I sat with that question for about 2 weeks in January. Real sitting. Not restless pacing, but actual sitting at the desk in my flat with the notes and the architectural piece I still hadn't finished and the journal email I still hadn't answered. And I thought about the obligation of a researcher who finds something true and the separate competing obligation of a human being who finds something that publication would destroy. Those 2 obligations do not always point in the same direction. I know researchers who have never had to choose between them. I used to be one of those researchers, I think. The things I write about are old enough that their participants are beyond being hurt. 17th century military ritual. Architectural restoration. The safely dead past. This was not the safely dead past. This was a Tuesday morning. This was a living man's grief held inside a living ceremony, inside a living institution that had, in its ancient, wordless way, decided to hold the line around him. I finished the architectural piece, sent it to the journal, got a polite reply saying they'd run in spring. I answered the overdue emails and took on a new piece, something on the history of military funeral protocol across Commonwealth nations, which I had agreed to before Windsor and which now felt almost uncomfortably close to home. I kept working on the Windsor notes, not to publish, to understand, because there was still the question that had been sitting in my chest since November, since the first morning with the glove, the question that predated even the East End guard and Gerald and the 6-second pause. How long has this been happening? Not this specific accommodation. I was fairly certain this was new, built around this specific soldier's grief. But the broader thing, the capacity for it, the institution's ability to hold a fracture quietly, to absorb a disruption without announcing it, to make a space inside the ceremony without breaking the ceremony surface. Was this a feature or a flaw? Was this the institution at its most human or at its most closed? Both, maybe. The same quality that allows a structure to protect a grieving soldier also allows it to protect things that should not be protected. Silence is not discerning. It doesn't know the difference between a fracture worth holding and a fracture worth exposing. That's a real tension. I don't resolve it. I hold it the way Gerald holds his post, faithfully, with full knowledge that some things don't have clean endings. February. The deviation in the East End guard's shoulders was measurably smaller. Gerald noticed first. He told me in the cafe, over his tea, carefully, the way he delivered all his observations, with the precision of a man who had learned that careless words cause the same damage as careless movements, and who had spent decades not making either. The lean is correcting, he said. Not gone, but the degree has reduced. I thought about what that meant. Not just biomechanically. I'd stopped being purely biomechanical about any of this months ago. The lean reducing meant the internal pressure was reducing. The grief was not gone, would not be gone, probably had years of work left in it. But the acute phase, the period where the body stops keeping its agreements with the mind, was easing. He was coming back, incrementally, the way all real returns happen. Not dramatically, not with a visible turning point, but in small corrections that accumulate into a direction. The pause. I asked. Still 6 seconds, Gerald said, but I expect it will return to 4. In time, when the RSM thinks he's ready. When whoever authorized the change judges the accommodation is no longer necessary, Gerald said, with the precision of a man who didn't speculate. I nodded. We drank our tea and coffee. Outside, February rain, gray and constant and patient. I went back in March. Gerald was there. He would probably always be there on ceremonial days, in the flat cap, with his precise stillness, and his 22 years of knowing what things were supposed to look like, and his sergeant's instinct for making sure his men were seen. The East End guard was in position. I watched his shoulders. The lean was there, but it was smaller. The ceremony moved through its sequence. The boots on the stone. the swords at their angles, the music filling the courtyard, and the crowd taking their photographs, and the whole ancient, meticulous performance of continuity doing its thing, the thing it has been doing for 3 centuries through plagues and wars, and the private interior states of the men performing it. The musical pause arrived. I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The music resumed. 5 seconds. Not 6. Not 4. 5. I wrote in my notebook. 5 seconds. March 14th. 1 second shorter. A small correction. Barely perceptible. The kind of adjustment you'd never notice unless you knew the foundation. Unless you've been watching the seams. Gerald caught my eye briefly. A single quiet nod. We see it. Here is what I know now. After 6 months of standing outside Windsor Castle, and for months of sitting with the notes and the question, I know that ceremonial ritual is not the same as ceremonial performance. That distinction matters enormously, and almost no one in a crowd makes it. Performance is what the tourists see. The spectacle, the totality, the beautiful old machine. Ritual is what Gerald sees, what I've learned to see, the human bodies inside the machine, and the ways the machine responds when those bodies are under strain. I know that institutions can carry things they cannot say. That carrying and concealment are not the same act, even if they sometimes look alike from the outside. That the difference lives in the intention, and that intention is almost never legible to the person outside the institution. I know that 2 extra seconds in a musical pause is an act of mercy. I know that a retired sergeant standing in the cold every Thursday is an act of love in the specific, discipline-shaped way that military men sometimes perform love, not tenderly, not with words, but with presence, with witness, with the refusal to look away. I know that I am a researcher who went to Windsor in November to kill 3 hours and came back 15 times and didn't write a single word of the article he theoretically went there to research, and that this is simultaneously a professional failure and the most important thing I've done in years. And I know, I have to say this because I think it's the most honest thing in all of this. I know that there was a moment somewhere around December where the question changed for me. Not what is wrong with this ceremony, but what is the ceremony doing with what is wrong? Because those are different investigations. The first one is the researcher's question. Cold, necessary, important, the right question in 100 other contexts. The second one is the human question, the one that lives in the part of the brain that is not cataloging disruptions, but sitting with them. The part that watched an actor cross a stage wrong when I was 12 and felt the wrong step as a thing that mattered, not just as a thing that was incorrect. The ceremony is doing something with what is wrong. It is holding it, quietly, without announcement, inside a 4-second pause that became 6 seconds and is now 5. It is counting down. Last Thursday in April, I went back one final time. The decision to make it final was not dramatic. No ceremony for the ending of the investigation, which felt appropriate, given everything. I just knew, driving up, that this was the last one, that I had what I came for, that whatever understanding I was going to reach had been reached, and continuing to stand in the cold in Windsor was no longer witnessing. It was something closer to seeking comfort from the familiar, which is a different thing and one I recognized in myself. Gerald was there. I stood beside him, not at the distance we'd been maintaining. Beside him, the way you stand beside someone when you mean them to know it. He glanced over, didn't comment on the proximity. The ceremony began. I watched the East End guard. The forward lean was very small now, a fraction of what it had been in November. If I hadn't known it was there, if I hadn't had 11 weeks of watching it as a consistent, identifiable pattern, I might not have been able to pick it out from normal postural variation. It was closing, not closed. Grief doesn't close, it narrows, it recedes, it goes from the foreground to a place you still carry, but no longer lead with. The boy's body was learning to make its agreements with the ceremony again. The musical pause came. I didn't count. I let it be what it was, whatever length it was, and I felt it in my chest the way you feel music sometimes, not as sound but as time. An amount of held time. A space that someone had made and was now slowly beginning to close. Gerald was looking at the East End guard. His expression was the expression of a man who has been watching a thing get better and knows better than to rush the conclusion. The music resumed. The ceremony moved to its final sequence. The full formal precision of it, the 3 centuries of accumulated discipline, all of it moving in the January to April courtyard air, and the tourists with their cameras, and the German families, and the yellow coat women, and all the crowd that watches the totality and doesn't look at the seams. The boots struck the stone for the last time. The formation held. The guards stood in their absolute performed stillness. And in the East End position, a young man stood at attention with his father 4 months dead, and 6 months dead, and 9 months dead, and he stood straighter than he had in November, and his shoulders had returned to their regulation angle. And from the outside, from the crowd's position, from the camera's position, he was indistinguishable from a man on either side of him. He looked flawless. He looked like the ceremony. Gerald exhaled beside me. A long, quiet breath. "He's almost there," Gerald said softly. "Yes," I said. We stood in the April courtyard after the ceremony cleared, while the crowd dispersed around us, and the photographers packed their equipment, and the old city of Windsor went about its business in the mild spring air. "What will you do with it?" Gerald asked. "Your research." I thought about it. "For real, not for the first time, but for the last time. I'll keep the notes," I said. "I'm not going to publish it." Gerald nodded. Not with relief, not with approval. Just nodded, the way he did everything, with the weight of a man who has long since stopped expecting the world to be uncomplicated. "There'll be something else worth writing," he said. "For a researcher, there always is." He adjusted his flat cap, looked at the now empty courtyard, the stone pale in the April light, the ceremony's footprints invisible, but felt the way certain things leave their impression in a place without leaving anything visible. "Thank you for coming back," he said. "It was good to have someone else watching properly." And then he put his hands behind his back, the way he always did, and he walked away at his deliberate pace, and I stood in the empty courtyard for a while longer alone. I drove home in the April afternoon, windows down, the motorway doing its motorway thing, the world moving forward with its ordinary relentless energy. My notebook on the passenger seat. All those pages, the glove and the pause and the sword angle and the blink rate and the deviation and the RSM's 2 steps and the 6-second pause and the 5-second pause and the morning I come to Windsor to kill 3 hours and the 22 years in Gerald's voice when he said I was a sergeant and the boy shoulders slowly correcting, slowly returning, carrying something his training didn't have a protocol for. I thought about what the ceremony was. Not the spectacle version, the real version. 3 centuries of men agreeing to perform the impossible, to make the body a machine, to submerge the private inside the public, to stand still when the body wants to move, to hold the line when the line is what's breaking. The agreement renewed every time a formation assembles, every time boots strike stone, every time a musical pause holds for 4 seconds, or 6 or 5. And what the institution had done quietly with 2 extra seconds and a sergeant check and the oldest protocol of all was say, "We know you are a person inside this. We know what you are carrying. We will not say it aloud. We will not make it visible. But we will make a space for it. A 6-second space. An unnamed, unannounced, unmeasured by any public record space. Hold on. We'll count you down." The motorway opened up past Slough. The April light on the tarmac. The world going forward. I thought about my ex-wife saying I watched the world like I was waiting for it to make a mistake. Maybe I'd been. For years. That attentive cataloging seemed finding vigilance with its underlying premise. Something is wrong, and I will be the one to find it. But in Windsor, over 6 months, in the cold and the rain and the gradually lengthening light, something had shifted in the premise. Something is held, and being held is not the same as being wrong. And the people holding are not always the ones you can see. The East End Guard returned to full regulatory standard by late April. The musical pause was 4 seconds at the first ceremony in May. The ceremony continued. No announcement was made. No record was altered. The accommodation was unmade as quietly as it had been made, and the performance of continuity resumed as it always had, as it always does, 3 centuries deep and moving forward. Gerald Fitch was in his usual position on the first Thursday in May. He was watching properly. He always is.